To be introducing this event, which promises to be a really informative and fun conversation. This event is part of an event series. It's part of our larger project that Slate does called Future Tense. This is a partnership with the New America Foundation and Arizona State University, where we look at how emerging technologies are changing culture and policy. We do a regular event series with these folks. But this one is going to be a doozy in particular. I'm going to talk a little bit about Steve Coll, our moderator, and then about Fred, who's hopefully the subject of discussion, and then I'll go through a little bit of housekeeping to how we'll run the evening. Steve, as I'm sure most of you know, is the Dean of the Columbia School of Journalism. He's also the author of Ghost Wars, and I'm going to refer to my notes to get your deck right. The Secret History of the CIA, Afghanistan, and Bin Laden from the Soviet invasion to September 10th, 2011. Also, he's the former managing editor of the Washington Post and the former head of the New America Foundation. Fred Kaplan is my beloved colleague at Slate, where he's our national security correspondent. He's written a number of wonderful books. He writes for Us Weekly on national security. And there are many, many things that I love about Fred, but I'm not sure there is anybody in Slate's orbit, and we have many wonderful people in our orbit, who so combines really penetrating, wide-ranging reporting with absolutely lucid prose. And whenever anything big happens in the world of national security, I just feel itchy until I know what Fred thinks. And I just wait for Fred's pieces to come in and figure out how I should feel about whatever it is that's just happened. And Slate's readers certainly feel the same way, and they always tell me that when I meet with them. So I was delighted to hear that Fred was going to tackle the topic of cybersecurity and cyber warfare in his next book, because it's one that seems incredibly important and incredibly poorly understood broadly, and it seemed like it would be a great service to us all, and Fred would just figure it out for us. And he seems to have done so, and also to have produced a ripping yarn of a book that has multiple kind of heist-esque break-in plots and references to pop culture, and it's a really wonderful read. We've done a couple excerpts from it on Slate and a couple of appeared elsewhere, but I can't imagine a more interesting conversation than having Steve question Fred, so I will give that to you in just a moment. Housekeeping first, though, please do silence your cell phones so you don't get interrupted by your beeps and buzzes. There will be a Q&A after. I think this mic will probably get passed around. Please wait till you have the mic. Ask the question when you have the mic. And do ask a question. Do not pontificate. Ask a question. These guys are smart. See what they have to say. Oh, yes, also you can follow the discussion online. We have a hashtag for the evening. It is hashtag Dark Territory, and you can follow us at Future Tense now. And copies of Fred's book will be available for purchase in the hallway after the event. All right, gentlemen, take it away.
Grace. Well, thank you, Julia, so much for doing that, and thank you all for being here. I want to welcome you all. I want to especially welcome the students in the graduate workshop that is also part of this evening's event from Columbia. Every spring I teach a reporting workshop on investigating armies and spies, and last year Fred came and spoke about military budgets. And but we have on the curriculum cyber war, and so we just decided to flip the order, and so he's going to be conducting a seminar quite literally for all of us tonight. So thanks, Fred, for doing this. It is a wonderful book. It's very readable. Fred has written a lot of great books. They start with The Wizards of Armageddon, which is an intellectual history of deterrence and the birth of the theory of mutually assured destruction that is real tour de force, and he talks about this book as, I thought you sort of saw it as a successor in a sense, of one like the counterinsurgency book,
right.
A kind of intellectual history of consequential defense.
All my books are essentially the same, so
Yes.
that's what I call them secret.
Yeah. So in reading this and thinking about cyber war, which is the phrase you chose, quite a common one, it is striking how diverse the activity is that's actually described in this history. It includes espionage, it includes information warfare, psyops, propaganda. It includes the tactical preparation of a battlefield by disabling somebody's air defenses. And then it includes the electronic version of a special forces raid, which is how I came to think of Stuxnet in your treatment. But start with the war, the bigger idea of war, which is kind of where the book ends up with the presidential decision directive about an offensive posture and this whole idea that we may be stumbling into a new era of warfare that we haven't thought through very well.
Right.
So if you think about the analogy to the nuclear age and the birth of these mad ideas in the 50s, what do we understand about cyber war as total war, as an attempt to decapitate another country's leadership or destroy its infrastructure or coerce its population? Is that really coming in the minds of our defense leaders?
Yes, it is. When this enterprise, in terms of exploiting the vulnerability of computers in particular, got started, the original phrase for it, it was highly classified at the time, was counter command control warfare. And the idea was that you would get inside the other guy's counter command control system to disable his ability to fight war, or to distort it, to send him false information, to make him think that airplanes are coming from here when in fact they're coming from there, to mess up his air traffic orders so that a refueling jet will be over here when the plane is supposed to be refueling is over there. Just everything, just messing him up. And one thing that I discovered, which was very interesting, is that in the early 80s, when Reagan was president, and you'll remember that the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, was going on about how the Russians were 10 feet tall, and we need to spend a lot of money to catch up with them, they're ahead of us in this. At the same time, the kind of black programs in the Navy and the NSA and some other programs were just getting inside of everything they were doing, chasing their submarines, knowing exactly where they were, intercepting their code, getting inside really critical command control with the ability not just to see what's going on, but to turn it off. And there was some thinking at the time that if the Russians did dare to go to war against us, we could shut them down before it even started.
Well, so we have arrived at, as you point out, this is a much deeper and older history than sometimes we think, and that history, including the late Cold War, did include plans that contemplated cyber attacks as part of Armageddon, a total nuclear war. But then, really, most of the episodes are not quite so grand in their offensive visioning. But we're now to understand that the United States has an offensive program of some sort, or offensive authorizations. We see in Stuxnet why a president might be tempted to use a raid that is non-violent but achieves an important strategic end. We can see why a president might want to go probe around adversaries' computers and lay bugs and watch what's going on. But are we, as the United States of America, developing, in your understanding, the equivalent of the Strategic Integrated Operations Plan, a PSYOP, a plan to just knock China on its back if we had to through these techniques?
Right. Well, here's how this has developed, just a little background. When this kind of thing was first getting systematized, they came up with some acronyms, as the military often does. So they talked about CND, which was Computer Network Defense, and CNA, which is Computer Network Attack. But then there was something in the middle, which was CNE, Computer Network Exploitation. And the idea was exploitation. It's like espionage. You get inside the other guy's networks to see what's going on, to see what they're doing, just as you might send a spy into a command center or a Pentagon or whatever to see what's going on. It's the digital equivalent of things that have been going on since time immemorial. But the difference here is that the difference between, and then you could say, well, this computer network exploitation is just an active form of defense. But it's also just one push button away from computer network attack. It's the same technology, it's the same skill sets, it's the same activity, And so, you know, we're inside Chinese infrastructure, they're inside our infrastructure. Why are they here? Well, we have to think that maybe they're going to blow up our electrical grid or something, and they have to think the same thing. So that if there is rising tension over something, the South China Sea or Taiwan or whatever, there might be a temptation to go first before the other side goes first. And they're already in there, so they can go first very quickly. So it's not even like with ICBMs where you get 30 minutes warning. Here you get no warning at all. So this is the very fact of this, which developed through, you know, pretty logical, rational thinking, is creating the preconditions and for an incentive for preemption. And the other
That
part
is a little bit like the 50s, isn't
yeah,
it?
it kind of is. Yeah, it's right. Well, we've got our stuff aimed at all the military, but that's because, you can rationalize your way into all kinds of things, and then you start examining the consequences, and the consequences of what the other side is doing. And it can get you into starting a war pretty quickly.
I was struck you report Robert Gates, the defense secretary until 2013, and he gives you your title by referring to dark territory in the railroad era of the Midwest that he grew up in. But you report that he tried to convene cyber powers, so presumably to include China, Russia, perhaps Israel, perhaps others, into a common conversation about rules of the road, and that one of his ideas was, well, we won't attack each other's water systems or electric grids or critical infrastructure.
Yeah.
And that this has not evolved. But in war, we do attack each other's electric grids.
Yeah, well, he meant it's short of war or something like that. But yeah, no, he was, he was Secretary of Defense. He's getting these daily briefings of hundreds of attempted intrusions. He's asking his legal counsel, at what point do these kinds of attacks constitute an act of war? He doesn't get an answer, really, because it's not really a legal question. And then it wasn't even so much a proposal, it's like corridor conversation. Like, we ought to get together and figure out some rules of the road, because there aren't any. At least during the Cold War, there were rules like spies didn't kill each other, that kind of thing. And he would get these brow-furrowed nods and not much else. And he said, we're wandering in dark territory here. And when I went back through my notes and saw that, I said, there's the title of my book. But of course, I Googled it to make sure it wasn't, a euphemism for some obscene activity or something. And it turned out to be a term of art in the North American railroads for stretches of track that are not governed by signals. And I'm thinking, wow, that's a really powerful metaphor. So I sent him an email, did you know this? He goes, oh yeah, my grandfather was a station master on the Santa Fe Railroad for 50 years. We use railroad terminology all the time. But that's the big danger is that everything we have now is hooked up to computers. There were studies of critical infrastructure going back to the 80s. What is critical infrastructure? Well, they lined up, banking and finance, transportation, electrical supply, water. And around the early 90s, commissions which were looking into this realized that they were all crucially dependent on automatic computer controls. I mean, Stuxnet, it wasn't a computer attack against the centrifuges that were spinning and imaging radium. It was an attack on these computer servers designed by Siemens, which controlled the rate at which the centrifuges were spinning. And so you went after that, which they believed were disconnected from any internet traffic, but the NSA has since figured out ways to get around that through somebody inserting a thumb drive someplace or any number of other attacks. But when this commission would look into this, so they'd call up, the head of PG&E or something like that, and they'd be bragging about how they're going online with everything now, and they'd say, well, what are you doing about security? And usually it was, well, what do you mean? What do you mean security?
Well, isn't that still the case, though? I mean, I read Richard Clark's book a couple of years ago. You provide a little mini review of it that's mostly sympathetic, but it emphasizes the distinctive position of an open society like ours, with the particular laws we have and have not passed,
Right.
that has delegated to utility companies, and presumably bank CEOs are a little more alert, but utility company CEOs are not necessarily alert to this. And so we have no laws as of now, as I understand it, that require certain levels
That's right.
of defensive performance.
When Clark was in the White House, he tried to, and Clinton was fine with it for a little while, to impose mandatory security requirements on critical infrastructure companies. Because this isn't just about private, this is national livelihood, right? And the lobbyists resisted it. Commerce Department, Treasury Department, Larry Summers, they all resisted it because this would impede research and development. When you put on security, you're also slowing down speed, so it weakens the competitive position of these companies. And at one point, he wanted to create a kind of parallel internet, or the networks of the critical infrastructure would be wired into a government agency, which once they were being attacked, could step into action. Well, this got leaked, and people on the Hill shouted Orwellian, and that got killed very quickly. And even Obama, last year, he signed an executive order on this. And it went a little bit further than the dozen or two executive orders that have happened recently. And except for there was one line which said, nothing in this order shall be interpreted as a mandatory requirement.
Right.
Regulation is still the bugaboo word for all of these companies.
Well, it may be over dramatic, but when you think about this pattern that we're in now, where we have a plainly inadequate defensive system around critical infrastructure because we don't have any defensive system around it. We have demonstrated offensive, both means and motivation, and we have a pattern of attacks that is building in magnitude over time. And that reminds me a little bit of the 2 or 3 years before September 2001, where you had a pattern of problems building in plain sight. You had no real alertness about the defense, and then they got imaginative and they hit something out of the park. So I keep waiting to wake up in New York City, and the lights are out for the next 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Are we vulnerable as an infrastructure to such an aggressive attack if someone were to carry it out?
Now, we're not completely centralized, so we're not going to shut down the power all across the United States, but you get things in the mail. Join our smart grid, get electric power from Boston if it's cheaper than what's coming from New York, and it's all connected and it's all controlled by computers. But see, here's where this has happened. The military, they've actually been working on this problem for a long time, to the point where they've whittled it down so there are only about 8 intersections between military networks and the wider internet. So the NSA can actually sit on top of those networks and see what's going on, and they have the legal authority to do so because it's military. A while back, people started to look at, well, how many points of intersection are there with civilian government? And they stopped counting when they got into the thousands. For private industry, who knows? And so here's what's happened. A while back, the NSA and Central Command, the U.S. Central Command was created. It's a combatant command having to do with cyber. It's US Cyber Command. U.S. Cyber Command. And because it's all the same, as I was saying before, it's all the same technology, the same skill sets, it was thought wise to make the commander of Cyber Command the same guy as the director of the NSA, and to centralize it all at Fort Meade. Okay, so they look at the problem of civilian government and private industry, and they realize, well, look, first, we don't have the legal authority to sit on all these networks. Second, there's just too many of them. So what is the solution? The solution, well, we have to do what was called computer network exploitation. The best defense is a good offense. Namely, we have to, and now they say this openly. They say this, the Defense Department doctrine on cyber talks about preventing attacks before they happen. Now, what does this mean? This means getting inside the networks and poking around so that you can tell when an attack is coming, and which might also foretell your own attack. And that's not as academic or paranoid or anti-American or whatever as you might think. From the very beginning, it's interesting. When I was first doing research on this, and I was talking to somebody pretty high up in intelligence, and I was going over a document that had been written in the early 90s, laying out our vulnerabilities and various scenarios that could happen if somebody attacked us. And he says, look, and everybody I asked subsequently, I asked the same question, if this was true, and they all said yes. He said, look, the thing you have to understand is that all these scenarios about them attacking us, this is what we've been doing to other countries for a long time. And at some point, somebody says, oh my God, wait, if we can do this to them, then someday they're going to be able to do it to us. It's a light bulb going off in your head. And so, in a way, all the rhetoric is, oh, China is doing this. And in fact, for a while, the Air Force was going to start publicizing. And the NSA a little bit too, about, maybe we should start publicizing our computer network attack, our cyber offensive operations. It's time to get this out of the closet. But then Obama got the idea to start publicly criticizing China for what they were doing, at which point Leon Panetta, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, shut down the Go Public operation because they thought it might make the president look hypocritical for attacking China for doing essentially what we do. Now, we don't do the same kinds of hacking as China. We don't need to get their trade secrets or, because we're ahead of them on this. But we get inside their infrastructure, we get inside their military networks. It's all, and is one worse or better than the other? I don't know.
Right, so, as a tax-paying American, you kind of like to know what your president's chain of command for total war is. And one thing that struck me reading the history of Cyber Command, because for those who are not Pentagon nerds like the two of us, and even I'm not quite clear about some important matters here, but we know that our military command around the world has been organized in these, what you refer to as combatant commands, right? So you have Central Command, which is in charge of the whole Middle East, Pacific Command, likewise Asia, and then there are some Uber commands or specialized commands, and one of those is Strategic Command, and it controls all of our nuclear weapons for war fighting, and would wage a nuclear war if one were ordered. And now you point out that Cyber Command has been born just a few years ago, and its combatant commander is the head of NSA. Right, so who does Cyber Command report to when it considers whether or not to develop a war plan for offensive combat against Russia?
Well, like most of these things, they have plans for everything. There's plans for everything. So they have plans for everything. Any kind of cyber offensive operation, even a little one, has to be approved by the President of the United States. Stuxnet, obviously. There were some things we did in Iraq. It has to be approved by the President. And that's still the case. But here's what's really kind of disturbing. So you have this Cyber Command. They have war plans that they kind of cooperate with all the combatant commands. Like, here are some things that you can use instead of bombs and bullets to destroy the targets that you have in your target list. And they also have the defense of the nation, which they've now rationalized as doing through offensively. So this technology has grown up. It's very sophisticated. Cyber Command has a $7 billion budget. The independent service commands, which are kind of reporting to it, have another 7. Tens of thousands of people. You go to the military academies now, you ask somebody, what are the smartest people specializing now? Oh, it's cyber. It's a growth area. But right now, there is a panel at the Defense Science Board in the Pentagon, which is writing a report on cyber deterrence. It is the first such report. Nobody knows what cyber deterrence is. They don't even quite know what it is you're trying to deter. What is the government's responsibility in this? Is it the government's responsibility to deter or respond to an attack on a bank? On 2 banks? On 10 banks? On a movie studio? On an electrical power plant? What is it? And then what do you do about it? Do you respond in kind? Do you respond not in kind? So basically, you have, you have this whole technology built up, this army built up, these war plans built up, and yet the most fundamental assumptions about policy, strategy, premises, that's still in a primitive state. And one reason for this is that for decades, this has all been tied in with the National Security Agency, which, you know, the joke used to be that NSA stands for no such agency. Everything about it, including its existence, was incredible. It was like a black hole. Stuff goes in, it never comes out. So nobody's been thinking about it except cryptologists and generals who are part of the scene. Whereas the nuclear weapons, you know, the minute that one went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, okay, there were secrets about it, but everybody knew what it does. You knew what it consisted of. You kind of knew what countries had uranium and what they might be able to do with it. And instantly there were people like economists and social scientists and political physicists starting to think about these basic questions like, well, how does a nuclear weapon change the nature of warfare? How does it change the nature of what we should be prepared for? There has been nothing like this in cyber until very, very recently.
And part of the reason you argue is because of the secrecy that surrounds it, and much of which you argue is unnecessary.
Well, we'll see what happens to me.
All right, well, we've been talking about kind of the history of the structure and the theory of cyber war, but the book also, which I think is alarming and important, but the book also has a history of sort of battles and episodes, campaigns, and I wanted to mention ask you about a couple of the more startling ones. You referred to the most startling one to me, which was an episode that I wasn't aware of. Maybe you broke the news, but it would have taken place on the battlefield in Iraq, roughly 2007.
Yeah.
Was it mostly in Baghdad or in the Sunni Triangle?
It was outside of Baghdad.
Yeah. So what happened?
Well, you know, 2007, that was the year things kind of began to turn in the Iraq War, at least tactically and for a short term. And this has been attributed by many, including me, in my last book, to the troop surge was part of it. The appointment of General Petraeus as the commander, who introduced a new kind of strategy, the counterinsurgency strategy. But one thing I didn't know until I started researching this was that the NSA had something to do with this too. At some point, they captured some insurgent computers. And they got into the passwords and the email list. And then they also started sending NSA analysts to Baghdad, to Iraq. Over a period of a few years, there were 6,000 NSA analysts sent there. 22 of whom were killed out on missions by roadside bombs, you know, to capture computers. So basically, what they would do, they would hack into these computers, and the linguists would kind of examine the language that was used, and so then they would send phony messages to everybody on the list saying, you know, let's meet at this place tomorrow at 4 o'clock. And when they got there, there were some special operations forces who were there who killed them. And also, you know, there were surveillance drones that could spot people laying roadside bombs, which was, of course, the main cause of American fatalities for a few years. In the old days, you know, this information was sent to Washington, it went to the Pentagon, it went to Fort Meade, it went back to Washington. It would take 16 hours to get back to Iraq, by which time these guys were long gone. Well, with the NSA in the field, everything could be done in a minute, and they killed a lot of these guys. So over the period of 2007, in these ways, about 4,000 insurgents were killed, which had a tremendous effect. One person that I was asking about this, I found out a little bit about it. He was kind of shocked that I knew, and he said, well, I've always thought that this is kind of the equivalent to the impact of breaking the German submarine codes during World War II, which of course remained classified for decades afterwards. Then the person said, but I can't say anything more about it because other people do. But yeah, I mean, it's things like that. Or, another thing that really stunned me was the war against Milosevic in Belgrade. Now, this was before computers, it was telephones. But, for quite a while, computers were hooked up to telephones, so it was the same thing. So there was something in the Pentagon called J39, which was a very dark, kind of black secret organization that unified the Joint Staff with the NSA, with the British counterpart, with some other secret outfits. And they decided to get inside of Milosevic's network in two ways. One thing, they found out that the air defense network was hooked up to the commercial telephone network. So there was something created in the CIA called...
This doesn't seem like a good idea.
No, it's cheap.
Yeah,
it's cheap.
okay.
It's like it's like computer sensors for our electrical.
Right.
Yeah. So an outfit was created in the CIA called the Information Operations Center, which kind of does joint operations with the NSA. IOC goes out and plants a thumb drive or puts a device on something, and then the elite hackers in the NSA, which is an outfit called the Tailored Access Operations Office, does the hacking from there. So somebody put something on the Central Telephone Exchange in Belgrade, as a result of which the NSA was able to hack into their air defense system and change the signals, hack in between the data link of the radar and the signals, and the radar screen. So a guy's looking at his screen, he thinks that airplanes are coming from over there, but in fact they're coming over here. So they don't shoot them down. They also, while they were inside the phone system, let's trace Milosevic's social network. They tracked down all of his entourage, and one of them owned a copper mine, and they said, okay, stop hanging out with Milosevic, or we're turning the lights out in your copper mine tomorrow. And he just hung up the phone. The next day the lights go out, and then he said, okay, the bombs are dropping tomorrow, and suddenly he's creeping away from Milosevic. They also just phoned the Milosevic residence relentlessly, just relentlessly. And they did all kinds of things like that. And this was the first sort of integrated information operations campaign. That's what they called it at the time. And there was a post-mortem about this by an admiral who said, this was both the greatest success and the greatest failure, in that we only did about 10% of what we could have done in this. We could have shortened the war by half. But the problem is that too many people in the operations units of it weren't clear. They didn't have the security clearances to know what was going on. Right?
Although I remember hearing about some of this at the time. People were very excited about what they were doing. Immediately after, not while it was happening. But before we turn to the audience, there's one other subject that I wanted to make sure we touched on, which is the question of surveillance by NSA of Americans, the debates about security and privacy that were started by Edward Snowden's revelations. And you have a chapter in the book about the commission that President Obama appointed to try to sort this out after Snowden and then libertarians in Congress and others put this on the table. And one observation you made was that the commission, I guess it was the commission, concluded that two of the programs that Snowden had highlighted and that journalists had highlighted as potentially alarming and subject to abuse, in the judgment of the commission, they had very different correlations to doing anything useful on behalf of public safety. So in the case of metadata, which was the subject of Lord knows how many congressional hearings and quite a lot of journalism, the commission found that searching metadata in the way that became controversial stopped zero terrorist plots. And on the other hand, PRISM, they judged, which was a named program that came out of the Snowden revelations, they judged it stops more than 53. So why is searching metadata not very useful policing, and why is PRISM, at least in their judgment, more effective?
Well, metadata, you might remember, that's the records, which, the NSA didn't create this. It's business records of the phone companies. It's not the content of the conversation, but it's who you call, what number you call, what numbers are calling you, when, how long the conversation lasted. And General Alexander, who was the director of the NSA, had this grand theory that you could trace terrorist networks by following the phone connections. And it just didn't quite work out. I mean, in some cases, let's say, really in one real case, about 5 suspects were all calling the same number. It turned out to be a pizza joint. It's that kind of thing. Just because you're all calling similar numbers doesn't mean that that's a network, much less a conspiracy. On the other hand, the program, which is on a different legal basis, PRISM, which is the NSA using court orders, FISA court orders, to hop on the backbone of servers, of Google and Facebook and AOL, whatever else is out there, to actually get on the networks themselves and to track things, foreign things. And there, it actually did have an effect. It's a very misunderstood thing.
I mean, when you jump on, this is above my engineering education, but I want to ask, when you jump on the backbone, can you discriminate?
Well, that's where it gets difficult. Basically, the idea was, okay, in the old days, if you wanted to tap somebody's phone, somebody from Pakistan is talking to somebody in Sudan. Well, you put a tap here, you put a tap there, you've got it in there. But
you're not listening to any other conversation.
Yeah, that's it. But with the internet and with cellular phones, it works the way the internet works, it's kind of stunning. Basically, you send out an email, it breaks into a lot of little packets, travels the most efficient route along cyberspace, and then comes back together. It's almost like, Adam Smith on steroids. It comes back together when it gets there. Well, where it goes, where the most efficient route is where digital bandwidth is concentrated, and 80% of all bandwidth is in the United States, because that's where most of the communication is. And it all happens instantaneously. So nowadays, if somebody in Pakistan is talking on a cell phone or doing internet traffic with somebody in Sudan, it's quite likely that at some point a packet of that is going to go through some pipe of fiber optic cable in the United States. And so Mike McConnell, when he was head of the NSA, he said, hey man, you don't need to set up these listening posts in hostile territory. We'll hop on the signal in the United States and ride it from there. Well, now the problem is, say you're looking at foreign communications. How do you know that it's foreign? They have these indicators, and when it gets to the point of a 52% likelihood that it's being foreign, they get on. They can look, they can listen. And then the rule is, if it's pretty clear right away that it's not foreign, it's one of the other 48%, they have to get off and destroy all the data at once. And sometimes there are irregularities in actually doing that. But essentially, it wasn't, when you first read these stories about, well, Jesus, why are they doing this inside the United States? It wasn't because they want to listen to your cell conversation. They don't have the slightest interest in you. It's because this stuff is going through the United States. But yeah, things get interspersed, and it's hard to do the one without the other. What this commission came up with, they concluded, it's an interesting thing, and if you read the book, my own kind of political, moral views are kind of wrapped up in that chapter. There was one of the people on the commission, one of them was our friend Dick Clark, but another one was a University of Chicago law professor named Jeffrey Stone, who had hired Obama to be a law professor in Chicago. And he was a civil libertarian, and he thought he was going to go in and look at a rogue agency. And he was asked after it was all over to come give a talk to NSA headquarters. Tell us what you learned, what lessons. And he came and he said, I had my suspicions. I get to the NSA. They seem to be very professional. There are a lot of legal things put in place. It's not, they make mistakes, but it's pretty much that's what they are, mistakes. And so you deserve the American people's respect and thanks sometimes, but you do not deserve their trust. We shouldn't trust you. And that's kind of my view too.
Because the capacity,
the potential for abuse is enormous. Like this metadata program, they have legal authority to track things that were related to 3 terrorist organizations, period. They weren't listening to every phone call. But, hey, you know, if it's President Trump, Attorney General Cruz, and NSA Director Chris Christie, a lot of these legal strictures are set up from within, which means they can be dismantled from within. And people from the outside might not even know about it.
And even with President Obama and Attorney General Holder and NSA Director Alexander, when mistakes were made in your understanding about segregation of U.S. persons, or this, I'm sure, imperfect formula that gets you from 48 to 52%.
Right.
Did you ever come across evidence that either frontline investigative officers or intelligence officers or their supervisors allowed some kind of political motivation or Islamophobia or some other thing to creep into the pattern of their mistakes? Like, let's just let this string run a little bit because
like
these guys are one
the Good Wife?
Yeah.
No, and the more telling thing is that neither did Edward Snowden. I mean, Snowden had access to a lot of stuff. If there was some record of this kind of thing, I think we would have heard about it. I was told, you know, that there were cases, because you read about them occasionally, of, you know, somebody's working in TAO, tailored access operations, he's got a girlfriend in Germany, he wants to check up on her. Who's she talking to? You should call him. And there have been cases like this, about 1 a year. And they usually track it down, or one known case a year, let's put it that way. But I asked one guy who worked at TAO, I said, and I don't mean this to be an apologia for the NSA, I mean, there are bigger issues. But I asked him, okay, if I came and watched you at work, what are you doing? What am I seeing you do? He goes, okay, I'm sitting at a console, I'm typing out code. So you're not looking, I'm typing out code. Behind me is a supervisor, and behind him is a lawyer, and they're all taking down every keystroke that I'm typing. So, I mean, the place is really crawling with lawyers who take these strictures very seriously. But again, it's all done internally, and it could be wiped out internally.
Yeah, it used to be that journalists had privileged access to driver's license information and driver's license plates.
Right.
After they stopped that.
They stopped that.
And I am aware, after a long career, of some management supervisory cases of the same character that you referred to in your tailored access operations. It's, you know, that kind of thing is inevitable in, you know, sort of bureaucracy, but it would be the kind of slow tidal enlargement of permissive systematic uses that you would be concerned about. And that capacity is
the capacity is enormous. I mean, imagine, you know, these guys, they, you know, people asked me when I was writing this book, you know, well, what are you doing? What should I do to protect myself? See, like, you know, if you're worried about a criminal or a punk or just a mischief maker who wants to get into your system and maybe steal your accounts or just annoy you, you know, there are things you can do. It's like getting a better lock for your front door. You can, you know, bolt your windows, you can get a burglar alarm, you can do all, you know, things like that. But if somebody wants to come after you, they want something that you have, and they really know how to do this, and especially if they have the resources of a nation state behind them. And they're really, really interested in this. There's really, there's nothing you can do. And even within the defense sector, there was another Defense Science Board study a couple of years ago on cyber war, and they realized that once in a while there will be a war game where a red team tries to get into our command control systems, data banks, you know, things like in the military. They always get in. They always get in. And in fact, most war games, they leave out a cyber component because the game would end all of a sudden, just shut down immediately. There would be no point playing this game. And so now the latest report, it talked about the inherent fragility of our architectures. The inherent fragility. So the buzzwords in these circles, and in a lot of industries too, they talk about detection and resilience. And they want to make sure that if somebody gets in, it's detected really quickly. Because there are cases where people get in and it's not noticed for a year, prowling around. So detection, and then resilience, that you can kick them out and you can repair what damage is done very quickly. I mean, as an example, and I learned this after I wrote the book, so this is like the bonus reel of the book. The Navy is now training people on ships to navigate using the sextant and the stars.
Awesome. Yeah.
Because just in case the data link between their communications and the GPS satellites is hacked.
Right, so let's open it up to the audience, but it sounds like your lesson is not just that in your day-to-day protection against criminals, you can become a better password creator and more disciplined and all of that sort of thing. But as to the kind of strategic risk to you, your friends, your family, your household, what you really ought to do is buy a lot of bottled water, and have a plan to walk across a bridge to some place that has a farm where you can live for the next 30 or 40 years.
Lots of canned vegetables.
Canned vegetables. Okay, there we go. All right, so yes, sir. I think there's probably a microphone, but just for the benefit of.
Hi. Just wondering, first of all, why you say utility CEOs are not alert? And also, it probably came out after your book, but I don't know if everyone knows, there was a cyber attack in Ukraine that was suspected to be Russian on one of the utilities there, and they actually got inside the utility computers and shut them down and shut down the whole system, causing a blackout of about 250,000 people.
Yeah, no, actually, there's something I just found out the other day about this. Now, somebody told me the reason for that is because the Ukrainians were shutting off electricity to the Crimea. So, I mean, one thing about these scenarios, nobody goes around doing this just for the hell of it.
Some people do.
Well, that's true. Terrorists can figure out how to do this. They might. But I mean, the Chinese aren't going to all of a sudden, any more than the Russians were going to launch a nuclear attack on Israel.
Right.
It's related to strategy. And in that case, yeah, it was the Russians. It was a cat and mouse game because, hey, who knows? After all these years, Crimean electrical power comes through Ukraine because it was made part of Ukraine 60 years ago.
And the problem with delegating defense to utility company CEOs, not to defame them as a class, but first of all, it's a very diversified, very federated business. Second, it's always been a very stable industry that has a very kind of bread and butter management culture. Right. And even if it was alert and energized and determined, you have hundreds and hundreds of these things and no standards. Right. So you have 350 people at lots of different organizations waking up every day saying, okay, even if I wanted to be the best, what would I do?
What would I do?
There's really nothing.
Well, there's good news and the bad news. It also means that China can't just use one formula to get into all of them.
Yeah, we are.
But yeah, their calculation is, look, okay, there are now these things called information sharing, ISACs, information sharing and analysis centers. You're a critical infrastructure industry. Come talk to the federal government. We'll give you a list of best practices and we'll give you the secret level briefing and things you can do. So, these guys are saying, well, let's say I spend several $1 million doing this. It seems to me that somebody will figure out a way around that, and then do I spend another several $1 million next year? And besides, if I do get clobbered, our estimates show that it's not going to cost that much more to clean up the damage than to prevent it. And then they say, well, what can you do for us, Mr. Government? And Mr. Government says, well, I can sit on your networks. Would you want that? Well, no, not really. No.
Someone on this side, yes. Good cause.
You alluded to this earlier, but can you talk a little bit more about deep packet inspection and
About what?
deep packet inspection?
Deep packet inspection, I think that's the PRISM.
Oh, deep packet
Yeah,
inspection.
kind of what that means for the average user who.
Well,
These are, you can explain the circumstances maybe where these operations are authorized by the FISA court. So
Oh,
if
right.
someone goes into
Oh,
the
okay.
background,
Right.
what is it that they're carrying by way of a search warrant? What is that warrant?
Right. Okay, well, there's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was in 1975. It was the result of church committee hearings, which uncovered extraordinary levels of abuse by both the CIA and the NSA into domestic stuff without any restrictions at all. So they set up a FISA court. And if you want to go do something, if you want to, hack into something that's domestic, if it's foreign, you don't need to go to the FISA court. But even these things, anything in the United States, they have to, it's not so much a warrant, because there was a revision to this.
So awesome.
My publicist did this.
Yes. Props. Yeah, but you can't hear us, so.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Is this back on?
He's got batteries anyway, so.
Yeah, we got the video going.
Our last moments are captured.
Anyway, there was a, can you hear me?
Yeah.
There was a revision, because when everybody realized about these digital packets, the idea of a warrant is that you set up something in a particular place against a particular person of a certain nationality. Well, cyberspace is everywhere. A warrant wouldn't really do much, because you're not looking, you don't know what the individual is. You find these things by inspecting. And so a FISA court order is something that is, by definition, very broad. It gives you the right to go do this. But even then, there are rules. You have to be looking for a certain particular kind of intelligence, a kind of organization. This is then reviewed by an attorney general and his committee on the NSC. I mean, it's not as arbitrary or quixotic as you might imagine. But yeah, the idea is to get inside these digital packets, which of course are interspersed with other packets, and that is where they have gotten into trouble. And this kind of very loose standard of the 52% chance that this is a foreign communication. And it's very rare that a FISA request to the FISA court is turned down. Sometimes it's modified, but it's rarely turned down. The FBI, by the way, is much worse. They have these national security letters, which are pretty much the same thing. They don't have to go through a FISA court. A regional bureau, a head of a region can put one. And it used to be that the person who receives a national security letter can never talk about it. It used to be not even to his lawyers. Now, one reform that Obama did put in after this commission was to put the time on 18 months. You can't talk about it for 18 months. And then that can be extended by a judge, but only if there is a specific national security reason to do so. But yeah, it's very loosey-goosey, and as I say, if somebody comes into office, if you imagine Richard Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover having the kind of technology, to just get away from speculative ventures about this election, if they had access to this kind of technology, if it had existed back then, they could have really caused.
They wouldn't have had to break into the Watergate Hotel.
They wouldn't have had to. They could have just happened. Woodward and Bernstein
Yes.
would just be two Metro reporters.
Yes, you please.
I had sort of a tangential question. What about espionage that's happening in plain sight? And by that I mean the Chinese buying up assets such as A123 Batteries in Massachusetts, and Jennifer Convertibles, and AMC Corp, the entertainment, the theater chain, and they want to buy the Chicago Stock Exchange. And is this just a place, a way for them to have their monies be safe?
Well, part of it is,
Or could they flip the switch and could it, you know what I mean?
well, part of it is certainly that. But there are technologies inside computer systems that are manufactured abroad. And there is some suspicion, and they have found a few instances where, malware has been found in the component that had come from abroad. Now, it's a little ambiguous whether it was there all along or whether it infiltrated it since, but yeah, it's a security problem that I think wasn't taken very seriously until a few years ago. And I would say that Snowden's revelations did have an impact in making people
But if
more
more
aware
power
of this
owns
kind
our
of
movie theaters, that's not a threat.
It's terrible.
I mean, am I missing something?
Well,
I know, I
there was a
value
movie-
my movie theaters, but
There was a movie that came out a while ago. I think the original script, the Chinese were the bad guys, but
Yeah.
they changed it to North Korean so they could get it into. But
That's what
movies are a funny
Sony
thing,
had,
though.
yeah.
What is the first time that a president of the United States, after
This is your
a
opinion.
cyber attack, has said publicly, "I will be retaliating in some way, a matter of my choosing, to this attack on our values and our way of life"? It was when North Korea hacked 70 pictures in retaliation for the release of the interview. Now, you wouldn't have seen that coming, right? All these hackings of banks and defense industries and the Pentagon, but the one that has risen to the stance of, this is why, with nuclear weapons, there's always been this bold red line between using nukes and not using nukes, which is one reason why nobody's used nukes for a long time, because you don't know. There have been moments of temptation when we can set off just a little nuke, and get me on food or whatever. They haven't done it because you don't know what comes next. Cyber, there are hundreds of cyber attacks every day, thousands of attempts.
Absolutely.
Where is the line between a nuisance and a national security threat? Nobody knows. You might cross that line without knowing it and set off mayhem.
if you're on the offensive side.
Yeah, right.
Yes, sir.
Given the recent conflict between the FBI and Apple and some the history of the U.S. getting involved in M&A in the security industry, for instance, when Check Point tried to buy SourceFire, it was blocked by CFIUS. What's your view on kind of the appropriate involvement of policymakers in the private IT security industry? I think by some estimates, there's between 1,100 and 1,400 private companies out there. They're very crucial in being able to address a lot of these threats. But I'd be curious to get your view on what that appropriate balance might be.
Yeah. Well, there are a few ways to look at this, and I'll try to be very quick in going through all of them. One, when Snowden's revelations came out, and a lot of Silicon Valley were howling in outrage, it reminded me of that scene in Casablanca where Captain Rameau says, "I'm shocked that there's gambling going on here," while the croupier was delivering his winnings for the night. They've been doing this for ages. I mean, dating back to the 1920s, when a leftover intelligence operation from World War I convinced Western Union to give them access to all telegraphs going in and out of the country. Then this led to AT&T with tapping phone wires, looking for communists and other agents. In the internet age, it's been a two-way street. It's actually gotten more complicit. Because, for example, if you're Microsoft or Cisco, and you want to sell an operating system or a router to the government, especially the Defense Department, it has to be vetted for security, and it's vetted through a division of the NSA called the Information Assurance Directorate. And these are the guys who make sure that the networks are clean. And so when Microsoft presented the first version of Windows for this kind of vetting, the NSA found 1,500 points of vulnerability. And they helped Microsoft patch them. Not all of them, most of them. They left a few open so they could get in. And Microsoft knew this. Just a few years ago, Google, their Chrome system, the source code got slammed by the Chinese, and the NSA helped them patch it up. Apple, I mean, it's true that Tim Cook is much more averse to any kind of relationship like this. That said, Apple has opened up 70 telephones under FISA orders. The whole point of iOS 8 operating system was to put a stop to that, so that when next time the FBI or the NSA comes to them and says, we want you to unlock this phone, they say, well, you know, I'd love to, but I can't.
But I mean, how do you interpret this turn? Because in light of the history you described, going back to Western Union and the complicity between telecommunications companies and the government, really through the whole 20th century.
Yeah.
And after Snowden, it was one of the things Snowden revealed was that this complicity continued. And sometimes it's about.
That was much faster than anybody.
Yes, and it was, sometimes you could say, I'm just obeying the law, but it was still voluntary in a lot of respects. Now, in the aftermath, Apple did embed its equipment in a form of encryption that obviously changed the relationship. So, how do you interpret that moment? Is it a turning point in the relationship between citizens and government around privacy with encryption as the intermediary?
We'll see. I mean, you know, a lot of these companies, they were worried about losing foreign markets because, you know, maybe people in Germany wouldn't buy their systems anymore because they thought there was an NSA backdoor in them. And I don't know, maybe there is. But so Apple devised this new security system as a way to get around answering this call. And then the FBI, or probably really the NSA, finds a clever workaround. They say, okay, look, no, we don't want you to open the phone. But you have this security layer where if somebody tries to type in 10 passcodes and they're all wrong, the data are erased. What we would like you to do is to just do a tweak in that layer so that it's
disabled it, right?
Or actually, the first proposal I understand was make it so that it's 1,000 times. And then we'll come in, or you can come in, because this is commercially available software, to do what they call brute force, where, you know, you do 5,000 passcode attempts in a second. Eventually you'll get there, you know? And then Apple says, oh, now you're asking us to do something completely different. You're asking us to do something, to create something that didn't exist, that undermines the security of not just this phone, but all of our phones. Now, I'm not a technologist either, so I don't know. I've been told by people, including some who are very much on Apple's side as a matter of principle, that actually there is a way to do this with this phone that won't undermine the security of all phones. However, it does also create a precedent where if they do it for this, then they will also have to do it for something else. And what's happened is that both sides are now elevating this to a battle royale. And the FBI, it's pretty clear, was looking for a case where they could create a new legal rationale for getting around encryption systems that really are getting very hard to break. But
so why, last question, the FBI Director James Comey has been obviously on a tear about this for even before they found this case, very public. And I was surprised to see that Michael Hayden, the former NSA Director, who has not been at all reluctant to defend torture or drones or lots of other elements of the national security state that he helped to lead, challenging Comey in public and saying he didn't agree with him. Does that run deep, or is that, was that kind of just a little bit of misleading surface noise?
Well, Hayden has Jesuitical training, which is one way to look at it. But no, what Hayden actually said was, I'm very much against creating backdoors, but I don't think that's what you need to do in this instance. He agreed with Apple in principle, but not in this particular case. I think it's a lousy test case. I'm not quite sure why, and I've talked to people in the industry who agree. I mean, it's not a Fourth Amendment case because this guy didn't own the phone. The county owned the phone, and the county has given consent to do whatever you want. The guy is dead. He has no privacy rights. The political optics are terrible. This wasn't just a drug dealer. This was a mass murderer who had been in touch with ISIS. But also, I don't think there's anything in this phone. Remember the thing about metadata. They've already examined the metadata. That's not in the phone.
Right.
They know who called this guy and who this guy called. And Admiral Rogers, the director of NSA, said in one interview, there's no foreign phone calls in this guy's metadata. So I don't know what's there.
Right.
But they have been looking for a case to expand their powers. And you know, if Apple wins in court, and this is what worries me, frankly, Dianne Feinstein has now introduced, well, I don't know if she's introduced it, she's written it, legislation that would require companies to disable their encryption when presented with a legal warrant. And if that passes, I mean, that goes way beyond what the FBI is asking Apple to do in this instance.
Right. Well, we're past time. I know we could go longer, but it was a pleasure. And
Same here.
thank you very much for doing this.